Joining me now for more on the role of the IMF and World Bank is Richard Escow, writer and senior fellow for the Campaign for America's Future. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, in that report, I don't know if you could hear it, but the reporter was talking about the role of IMF policies in developing countries that have hurt their economic growth, pushing neoliberal policies and privatization. Now, I think in the developed world, people aren't really familiar with what exactly that means. But I mean, anybody on the streets of Brazil where I've reported, a homeless person can tell you the impact it had on their country. Can you kind of break it down a little bit, what these policies are?
Sure. The IMF, since its creation, and especially in the last few decades, has always tended to push austerity measures on the governments that come to it for help, very severe ones in terms of social programs, aid for the poor and retirement benefits and that sort of thing. And along with that, they also have very strongly emphasized deregulation of the banking industry, the financial sector, loosening the rules, privatization of state-owned businesses and that kind of thing. And a lot of people feel that's gone to such an extent that it's destabilized a lot of these countries, including the Middle Eastern countries mentioned in the report, and contributed to the conditions that led to the uprisings there.
And would you agree that the policies of the IMF benefit the creditors of these loans, corporations that come in and buy up companies and hurt the average people, the working people in these poor countries?
I think that generally is true. I think that's been the experience in modern times, for sure. I don't think that was the original intent when the idea was first thought up, but I think that's what we've seen play out any number of times.
Why? Who does it benefit? Who's pulling the strings that's making that happen?
Well, you know, I think what you have here is a situation where, when I used to participate in missions for the World Bank, for example, 20 years ago, we used to sometimes say over drinks or whatever, what would it be like if Europe or the United States had to deal with these kinds of rules and these kinds of impositions? So I think if you look at what's happening in the United States now, what you're seeing is that financial institutions are given priority in terms of they're considered critical to the economy, they're private banks and so on, but they can't be allowed to fail, they need to prosper. And I think the similar kind of thinking has driven the IMF, and so what you see is austerity measures, reduce the pressure on the banks, make sure that creditors get paid back for loans to governments and so on, and what that means is cut back in programs for people, you know, causing more misery, really, and a greater maldistribution of wealth that prevents the ability to fight poverty.
Right. Now, we're talking about the IMF while they're meeting just really a few blocks away from where I sit here in Washington. Do you expect anything to come of this meeting? Because one of the major criticisms of the IMF is that nothing can really get done these days.
Well, it's getting worse, actually, because now you have the G20, the group of 20, and they're staking their own ground, and so you have these kinds of political squabbles between one group and the other. It's been a little disappointing, frankly, in terms of U.S. policy, which is still a guiding force behind all of this. So I'm not optimistic that we're going to see any kind of meaningful change. I think they're feeling the heat and the political pressure, and their rhetoric is changing to reflect that, but I still think we've got a long way to go.
You share the sentiment with a gentleman that was interviewed in the story that our reporter did, that, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. He expects the leader of the World Bank and IMF to be European and American, same as they've always been, even as we see the BRICS countries meeting right now calling for a greater role. At what point will the IMF have to give emerging countries that have growing economies and billions in their populations more control and more of a say in these organizations?
Well, it may be that the only way that will happen is if more countries choose to default rather than pay these loans. Something is going to happen, have to happen to get their attention before there is a fundamental change in the way this group is organized.
Do you think that there is any sense that any of these countries that have IMF loans that are hurting their economies would do that?
Well, you know, all of these countries are walking a political tightrope now. We're seeing it in Portugal with the politics there. We saw it in the elections in Ireland. And, you know, the Western countries so far have been able to avoid it and swing the other way, but in the developing countries, there's enormous pushback, and there's going to be a point at which it's going to be politically impossible to agree to the terms of the IMF. So they'll either adjust their loans, or they'll start to see some defaults and some pushback, and they'll have to change their structure.
Really interesting perspective. Great speaking with you about that. That was Richard Esco giving a different perspective than what you're going to hear at that IMF meeting. Writer and senior fellow at the Campaign for America's Future, rather.